In cities like this, some secrets are worth more than entire lives. Hello, my friends. Before we start this incredible story, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, okay? And remember to like and subscribe to the channel for more intriguing stories. The city of Brighton in 1957 was not exactly a haven for restless souls, but it was there, among the damp alleys and peeling facades, that Daniel Whitaker lived, a private detective whose life was a mosaic of unsolved cases and unhealed loves. On that grey morning, the wind blowing off the English Channel brought more than the smell of the sea. It brought an omen. Daniel woke abruptly to the metallic sound of knocking on the door. When he opened it, he found himself faced with a woman whose gaze seemed to carry the weight of an entire century of secrets. She was wearing an impeccable navy blue overcoat, leather gloves, and a slightly tilted hat. But it was her scent, a woody perfume with notes of jasmine, that instantly disconcerted him. "Mr. Whitaker, I need your help," she said, almost in a whisper, as if she feared the walls might hear her. She introduced herself as Eleanor Fairfax, heiress to one of the most traditional families in the Sussex countryside. Her expression oscillated between the haughtiness of someone raised in gilded salons and the fragility of someone who lives daily with ghosts, real or imagined. She sat down opposite him, crossing her legs with an elegance that seemed out of step with the decadence of that cramped office, and placed on the table an old, slightly yellowed photograph showing an imposing mansion surrounded by fog. "This is Hollowmere Abbey. My family disappeared from there 3 nights ago," she announced, staring at him with eyes that seemed to beg and at the same time hide. Daniel, accustomed to cases of adultery, fraud, and blackmail, immediately realized that this was out of the ordinary. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward, his fingers drumming on the mahogany top. Eleanor took a deep breath before continuing, her voice almost trembling. "My uncle, my cousin, and my fiancé. They all disappeared on the same night, after a dinner, and what was left was this." From her leather bag she pulled out an envelope sealed with red wax, stamped with a strange circular symbol formed by spirals and geometric figures that evoked something indecipherable, almost ancestral. When Daniel broke the seal, he found a letter written in a handwriting that bordered on the grotesque with disjointed words, veiled threats, and references to something called the Void Bloodline. Is this some kind of joke?" he asked, frowning. But Eleanor didn't smile. Instead, her expression hardened, and a stubborn tear slipped silently through her eyes. "Mr. Whitaker, I know how this sounds, but I've seen things in that house. Doors that locked themselves, reflections that didn't match reality, and there are whispers, Daniel. Whispers coming from the walls." The detective sat back, lighting a cigarette with slightly shaking hands. Something about the woman, or perhaps that symbol, took a chill out of him that he usually ignored. "Eleanor," he said, looking her straight in the eye, "do you want me to find your family, or do you want me to find out what's really hidden in that abbey?" She didn't answer right away. She just lowered her gaze, her gloves tightening, as if she were holding something invisible and painful. "Both, Mr. Whitaker, both!" The drive to Hollowmere felt like a journey into the very belly of oblivion. As they drove along country roads lined with gnarled oaks and moss-covered hedges, Daniel watched Eleanor in the rearview mirror. There was something about her that didn't quite fit. Not just her sadness, but a heavy silence that came with hiding truths that were more dangerous than they seemed. "You haven't told me everything, have you?" he snapped, breaking through the awkwardness. Eleanor took a few seconds, then answered, her voice as low as the engine's shuddering climb. "Actually, no. There are things that I'm not sure you're ready to know." When they arrived, the abbey was imposing and decaying, a scar of English aristocracy forgotten by time. The black stones of the facade reflected the humidity of the afternoon, while tall windows, some broken, others boarded up, looked like the eyes of a forgotten corpse. On the rusty gate, a sign hung, half-fallen, reading Fairfax. Estate, private property. Eleanor hesitated, clutching her coat tighter, as if trying to protect herself from her own past. "The house does not take kindly to strangers," she whispered, more to herself than to him. Daniel pushed open the gate, which creaked with a sound so high-pitched it sounded like a scream. As they crossed the abandoned garden, he noticed that there were fresh marks in the mud, human footprints, and others that he couldn't immediately identify. When they approached the front door, it was already ajar, as if someone or something was waiting for them. "Are you sure there's no one else?" he asked, his hand instinctively reaching for the inside pocket of his overcoat, where he kept his old Webley pistol. Eleanor shook her head, pale. "No one. Alive." As they walked through the main hall, the smell of damp wood, mold, and something metallic, maybe rust, maybe blood, filled the air. Frayed carpets, pictures covered in sheets, and dust-covered furniture made for the atmosphere of a domestic mausoleum. But there was something else, something barely perceptible, a muffled sound, a vibration, as if the walls were breathing, slowly and deeply. Daniel stopped in front of a stone fireplace where an old portrait caught his eye. It showed a man with hard features, deep-set eyes, and a stern expression. On the frame was an inscription: Jonathan Fairfax, 1872-1929. The signature, however, had something strange, a spiraling sequence of symbols identical to the seal. On the letter Eleanor had given him. "Who is that?" he asked without looking away. Eleanor approached slowly, swallowing hard. "My grandfather. He died here, officially of cardiac arrest, but—" She hesitated, clutching the collar of her coat. "Some say he killed himself. Others say he never really died." The sentence echoed in the silence, cutting through Daniel like a cold blade. And at that exact moment, a dull crash resounded from upstairs. Something or someone had knocked over some heavy furniture. They both looked at each other, and Daniel whispered tensely, "Stay behind me and don't make a sound." They climbed the creaking stairs with careful steps, while the low sound of the wind seemed to merge with distant whispers, reverberating between the boards and the peeling walls. Daniel held the pistol firmly, his eyes alert, scanning every corner of the dark corridor. In the distance, a half-open door revealed a shadow cut by beams of light that escaped through the cracks of the broken window. Eleanor clutched her coat to her chest, and her breathing became increasingly shallow, not only from fear, but from memories that began to emerge forcefully, like forgotten corpses under the waters of the past. Pushing open the door, they revealed an old office, the shelves crammed with dark-covered books, aged maps and documents scattered across the table betrayed decades of obsessions. But there was one detail that froze Daniel for a few seconds. In the center of the carpet, there were clear marks of furniture that had been dragged, but with no sign of the furniture itself, as if they had simply disappeared. On the opposite wall, a shelf had been displaced, and as he approached, he noticed a lever hidden among the books. Without thinking twice, he pulled it, and a secret door creaked, slowly opening, revealing a spiral staircase that descended into the bowels of the house. "Did you know that?" he asked, staring at Eleanor. She shook her head, her eyes wide. "My grandfather, he would spend hours locked up in here, but I never imagined that." They descended step by step, until the natural light was gone, replaced by almost total darkness. The smell of damp earth, burnt oil, and something else, something that reminded them of old meat, assailed their nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs, a narrow hallway led to an iron door, locked with chains and an ancient padlock. Above it, a partially corroded Latin inscription read, "Non omnis moria." "I will not die completely." As Daniel examined the padlock, Eleanor ran her fingers along the stone wall when suddenly her eyes fixed on something. "Daniel!" "Look at this," she whispered, pointing to a crack. Inside was a carefully hidden laminated envelope. Daniel tore open the plastic and found a series of documents, certificates, maps, bank records, and, in the center, a letter dated 1935, signed by Jonathan Fairfax. The contents were disturbing. In the letter, Jonathan described a deal, not just financial but spiritual, with a society called the Ordo Silenti, which promised to guarantee prosperity and longevity in exchange for sacrifice. And he wasn't talking metaphorically. Before they could process the weight of that revelation, a muffled sound, like quick footsteps, echoed back up the stairs. Someone knew they were there. Daniel drew his gun, pulling Eleanor into a corner. The chains on the iron door began to move, not from them, but from within. 1, 2, 3 knocks, heavy, rhythmic, as if something were trying to get out, or as if it had always been there, waiting. The sound of the chains dragging suddenly stopped, giving way to absolute silence, so heavy it seemed to press against the bones. Daniel pulled Eleanor by the hand, backing slowly until they were both back on the top landing of the stairs. The detective knew how to recognize the fine line between courage and stupidity, and forcing that door now seemed more like suicide than bravery. Still with his gun in hand, he quickly searched the office until he found an old cabinet built into the wall. Picking the lock, he revealed a collection of folders, all marked with dates, names, and numbers. Lots of figures. "What is that?" Eleanor murmured, reading over his shoulder. It didn't take Daniel long to realize that this was more than just a family diary. It was a record of transactions, land purchases, acquisitions of bankrupt companies, donations to local politicians, and at the center of it all, a recurring name, W. Blackthorne Limited. As he flipped through it more quickly, his eyes caught something that made his stomach turn, a deed dated 1943 that transferred ownership of an entire plot of land in the south of the city to an odd name, Isaac Corbin, trustee of the Ordo Silenti. Daniel clenched the paper between his fingers. This isn't just one rotten family, it's a network. This goes way beyond you, Eleanor." The sound of wood breaking downstairs made them freeze. Someone, or more than one, had just entered the abbey. Daniel turned off the lantern, grabbed Eleanor by the arm, and dragged her silently into the hallway. "We have to get out of here, now." They crossed to the side hallway, where a cracked window looked out onto the back of the property. As he forced it open, the glass gave way with a sharp crack. "Jump!" he ordered. Eleanor hesitated, but did as she was told, falling onto the damp lawn. Daniel jumped right after them. Behind them, heavy footsteps, muffled. Voices and flashlights swept through the interior of the house. "Search everything! They can't take anything!" A gruff, masculine voice shouted, full of authority and terror. Hidden behind a stone wall, Daniel squeezed Eleanor's arm. "Who else knows about this?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the movement inside the house. She took a few seconds, then took a deep breath and, for the first time, seemed willing to tell the truth. "Daniel, my father, he knew. He was part of this. But 2 months ago, he disappeared." The revelation hit Daniel like a punch in the gut. "Why the hell didn't you tell me this before?" he burst out, trying to control his voice. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, tears threatening to fall. "Because I didn't know if I could trust you. And maybe I still don't." The sound of a car pulling away caught their attention. They looked toward the main gate and through the cracks saw 2 men throwing something into the trunk of a black Jaguar. Daniel adjusted his cap, took a deep breath, and like a predator smelling blood, whispered, "If we're going to understand what's happening, it's now. Let's follow them. And Eleanor, whatever it is you haven't told me yet, I swear on everything that it will cost me dearly if I find out on the way." The black Jaguar snaked through the country roads, cutting through the humid night like a blade through flesh. Daniel, at the wheel of the old Ford sedan, kept enough distance to not be noticed, but close enough to Keep them in sight. Eleanor, in the passenger seat, kept her eyes fixed on the road, her face pale, her hands shaking. The silence between them was almost as thick as the fog that was beginning to descend over the hills. If you want to tell me now, it's your last chance. After that, there's no going back, Eleanor, Daniel said without looking away. She bit her lower lip, took a deep breath, and after a few seconds of hesitation blurted out, "My father, he didn't disappear. He ran away." The revelation cut through the air like a razor. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel, but said nothing. He ran because he knew everything was about to fall apart. The Ordo Silenti. It's not just an ancient society. They control lands, companies, judges, police, even part of my family. My uncle has always been the strongest link, and also the cruelest. My father tried to break away, tried to negotiate his own freedom, and disappeared. But I know he's alive. Somewhere. Her voice broke, not from fragility, but from someone who has lived with the weight of her own choices and her own sins for too long. The Jaguar turned off the main road onto a dirt road lined with eucalyptus trees. Daniel turned off the headlights and drove into the darkness, guided only by the distant lights of the car in front. A few minutes later, they pulled up in front of an old, seemingly abandoned industrial warehouse. Through the crack in the window, Daniel watched. 3 men were unloading what appeared to be a body, wrapped in black tarpaulin and dragging it inside, but something else caught his attention even more. A 4th person emerged from inside the warehouse, a thin man in a grey suit, with well-combed hair, an angular face, and a deep scar on his chin. Eleanor froze instantly. "My God, it's Mr. Blackthorne." "Who?" Daniel turned, his voice more strained than he would have liked. "Walter Blackthorne, a lawyer. But not only that, he's the man who makes things disappear. Documents, people, entire lives." Daniel leaned back, pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and blew out the smoke slowly, as if that would organize the chaos building in his mind. "Perfect. So we're not just dealing with disappearances anymore. We're dealing with cleanup. And cleanup, Eleanor, is the last stage before oblivion." As they watched, the shed doors closed. The clang echoed in the night, followed by the sound of a key turning inside. Daniel narrowed his eyes, thinking for a few seconds. "We're going in," he said dryly. Eleanor's eyes widened, grabbing his arm. "You're crazy, Daniel. They kill people like they blow out a candle." He turned slowly to her, staring at her so that his voice sounded colder than any wind that night. "And do you think that if we don't go in now, they'll simply forget they saw you at the Abbey? No, Eleanor. Either we cross that line, or we'll be next on the black tarp." Daniel walked around the side of the shed, his steps precise, his body low, almost glued to the shadows cast by the opaque moon. Eleanor followed him, her gaze fixed on the ground, trying not to trip over the dry branches and stones that were scattered across the unkempt terrain. When they reached the back, they found a half-open side door, from which a timid beam of yellowish light escaped. Daniel drew his pistol, took a deep breath, and motioned for her to stay back. As he slowly pushed the door open, the creaking sounds mixed with the muffled sound of voices inside. Voices arguing, tense, almost on the verge of explosion. He crept past a pile of broken crates until he could see inside. The scene was grotesque. In the center of the warehouse, a steel table stained with rust, or blood, and on it, documents, maps, and photographs. But that wasn't what paralyzed him for a few seconds. In the corner, thrown on the floor like a garbage bag, was a body. Not a corpse, but a man visibly alive, beaten, tied up, bloodied, and even with his face swollen and covered in bruises, Eleanor didn't need more than a second to let out a muffled groan of terror. "My father!" The man in the grey suit, Walter Blackthorne, paced impatiently, holding a cane with a carved skull on the handle. "You had your chance, Fairfax. We told you there was a price, and you wanted to play the hero. No one walks away. No one betrays." His voice was cold, sharp, and laced with contempt. Beside him, two thugs stood silently, holding tools that looked more suited to butchers than negotiators. Blackthorne tapped his cane on the ground, took a deep breath and said, "We'll finish this today. Then we'll deal with the daughter." Daniel's blood ran cold. The time for waiting was over. He raised his pistol, aiming at the first henchman. He knew he wouldn't get a second chance. He pulled the trigger. The shot was dry, muffled, and the man fell immediately, making no sound other than a dull thud. The second henchman drew his gun, but Daniel was quicker. Another shot, and the man fell against the wall, leaving a red trail that slowly dripped down. Blackthorne, taken completely by surprise, threw up his hands, backing away. "Wait, we can talk," he stammered, his arrogance vanishing like smoke. "Shut up," Daniel growled, stepping forward. Eleanor ran to her father, kneeling beside him, her hands shaking, trying to pull him free. "Daddy, my God, you're alive!" she sobbed as he struggled to open his swollen eyes. Daniel grabbed Blackthorne by the lapel, pinning him against the wall. "You're going to tell now everything. Who else is in on this? Who's paying? Who's behind this damn game?" Blackthorne was shaking, but there was still something in his eyes, a cold contempt, as if he were looking at a bug he'd accidentally bitten. "You think you understand? You don't know half of it, detective, not half of it." What Blackthorne revealed in the next few minutes was not a confession, it was a sentence. And it would be the thread that would pull the whole ball of yarn together, revealing a web much larger and darker than Daniel could ever imagine. "Do you really think this all started here, in this forgotten town?" Blackthorne spat, his voice hoarse, his eyes narrowed as if his own indignation gave him breath. This is just the surface. The Fairfaxes were never just any family, Mr. Whitaker. They are the facade, the veneer. Beneath it is something much bigger, something that began over 50 years ago, when the town of Brighton decided to drain its own marshes, and in the process buried more than mud. Daniel pressed his hand to the man's lapel, the pistol pressed to his chin. "Speak. Speak now before I decide I don't care about the answers anymore." "Land, detective? It's always been about water and land. Hollowmere's underground holds more than just roots and rocks. It holds waterways, groundwater, springs worth more than any mine. The Fairfax, the Ordo Silenti, the Blackthorns, all of us. We've built entire cities, factories, neighborhoods on the control of these resources, but there was a price, there always has been." He took a deep breath, looking away for a second toward Eleanor, who was holding her father's hand, now weak, her face almost unrecognizable. Daniel took a step back, trying to process. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the picture that was emerging was even more disturbing than he had imagined. "And what is that price?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Blackthorne smiled. Not a smile of victory, but of someone about to put the final nail in the coffin. Silence, always silence. Entire families have disappeared, records have been erased, maps have been redrawn. Those who objected are gone. Those who knew too much are gone. And now, detective, guess who's on the list? Suddenly, a metallic noise broke the moment. Old Mr. Fairfax, until then motionless, almost unconscious, managed, with supernatural effort, to reach a small piece of rusty pipe that was lying beside him. In a desperate blow, he hit Blackthorne's leg, who screamed and fell, collapsing against the crates. Daniel didn't think twice. He pulled Eleanor and her father, dragging them out of the shed. Behind them, the sound of more voices, running footsteps. "They're not alone, Daniel," Eleanor cried, terrified. "There's more coming!" The trio ran toward the car as gunshots echoed off the shed's tin walls. Daniel pulled Eleanor with one hand, holding his unconscious father with the other. As they reached the Ford, bullets ricocheted off the bodywork. The engine coughed, sputtered, and then roared, tearing away down the dirt road. In the rearview mirror, Daniel saw the armed figures chasing after them, but they were soon behind, swallowed up by the fog and the distance. Inside the car, Eleanor sobbed, holding her father's hand tightly. Daniel squeezed his eyes shut, his jaw tense, and muttered, more to himself than to her, "This isn't over, not by a long shot." The Ford drove through the city, limits just before dawn, the sky tinged with greys and blues, reflecting the weight of the secrets they carried. Daniel parked discreetly behind the Old Mariner's Rest Hotel, a place he knew well, a hiding place for those who needed to disappear temporarily without asking questions. Eleanor helped her father stay conscious while Daniel locked the car, his eyes searching every shadow, every suspicious movement. The city seemed to be slowly waking up, oblivious to the rot that was brewing beneath its very foundations. In the cramped room, filled with the smell of mold and tobacco, Daniel placed the pistol on the dresser and spread out on the bed all the documents they had managed to steal from the warehouse before their escape. Hydraulic maps, land purchase records, contracts with hidden clauses, everything led to the same truth. Brighton had been sold piece by piece, generation after generation, to a hidden consortium that controlled everything from water reserves to urban expansion, flows. And at the center of this web, the name Fairfax was etched like a scar. "What didn't you tell me, Eleanor?" Daniel asked, his eyes never leaving the papers, his voice firmer than ever. She hesitated, clutching her arms tightly as if trying to protect herself from what she was about to say. "Daniel, my fiancé. He didn't disappear into the Abbey by accident. He was investigating me. He found out more than he should have, and disappeared. And I kept quiet, because if I spoke, I knew it would be the end of me too." The revelation hit him like a dull blow. "So you didn't look for me just to find your family. You looked for me to survive." The silence that followed was as heavy as a freshly closed grave. Old Fairfax coughed, his voice scratchy and weak, but enough to break the knot of tension. They won't stop. You have no idea what you're stirring up. The water is just the beginning." Daniel turned to him, eyes narrowing. "What do you mean by that?" The old man took a deep breath, clutching his chest, and with an effort that seemed to come from hell itself, he answered, "The foundation of the city is not made of stone. It is made of pacts, ancient pacts, things that should never be unearthed." Daniel raised his hand to his mouth, massaging his chin, his gaze lost. The old man's words were not just metaphors. In the documents, he found an even older letter, dated 1894, signed by Jonathan Fairfax and Isaac Corbin. In it, they spoke explicitly of a ritual sealed beneath the city's central reservoir. It wasn't about superstition, it was about control, about fear, about keeping an entire population obedient, thirsty, dependent. "My God," Daniel whispered, holding the paper with trembling fingers. "This is it. This is why they're willing to kill anyone who comes near." Suddenly, there was a sharp, metallic sound, the bedroom doorknob turning slowly, followed by 3 precise knocks, like a sentence. "Announced." Daniel drew his pistol, turned quickly, and signaled Eleanor to be quiet. Old Fairfax narrowed his eyes, pale, whispering almost voicelessly, They found you." The silence that preceded the 4th knock was so absolute that Daniel could hear his own heart pounding in his ears. His hand tightened on the butt of his pistol, and cold sweat trickled down the back of his neck. He motioned for Eleanor and his father to hide behind the old cabinet while he stood by the door, gun raised. Finger on the trigger, another knock, dry, precise, cruel, and then a male voice, too polite to sound honest. "Mr. Whitaker, we know you're there. Let's talk. Just talk." The devil always comes disguised as a diplomat. Daniel took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a second, and then, in a quick movement, opened the door with the barrel of his gun pointed. On the other side, 2 men in black suits, grey ties, and neatly aligned hats, the kind who looked more like real estate agents than anything. More sinister, if it weren't for the fact that they were both armed, with holsters on display and eyes that pierced through flesh and bone. Behind them, parked on the street, a black Bentley gleamed like a luxury coffin. And stepping out of the back seat, a figure appeared that Daniel hadn't expected to see so soon. Walter Blackthorne, whole, clean, unharmed, as if the previous night had never happened. "Daniel," he said, adjusting his cufflinks, his smile impeccable. "Let's stop this act. Everyone here knows where this is going, so why don't we talk like gentlemen?" Daniel didn't answer. He moved slowly, keeping his pistol level, until they were inside the room, and then he kicked the door shut with a sharp kick. "Talk, and talk fast, Blackthorne. You've got until I lose my temper, which at this point is about 10 seconds. Blackthorne took a deep breath, straightened his jacket, and the smile gave way to a harder expression. "You don't understand, Detective. This was never about you. It was never about Eleanor. This was always about maintaining order. There are things you shouldn't have seen, documents, maps, pacts. You don't realize that this," he gestured to the papers scattered on the bed, "isn't just corruption. It's survival. This is how things have been since before you were born, since before your parents were born. And this is how it will always be." "What are you talking about?" Daniel growled, his grip on the gun tightening. "Water, money, land?" Blackthorne looked him in the eye, and for the first time, Daniel saw something there that made him shiver. It wasn't fear. It wasn't arrogance. It was emptiness. An emptiness so absolute it felt deeper than existence itself. "I'm talking about control, Detective. Keeping the world exactly as it is, and those who dare to change it, those who dig too deep, just disappear. You have a choice. Now, get out of it, or get in and never leave." Behind him, Eleanor watched in silence, her eyes brimming with tears, her hands pressed to her lips. She knew in that moment that whatever choice Daniel made would come at a price, an irreversible price. And the cruelest part of it all was that there might not even be a choice. The silence that fell after Blackthorne's words seemed to compress the very air inside that filthy room. Daniel stared into his eyes, but in that moment, he realized something that neither weapons nor answers could solve. This was a game that had already begun, long before he was born. A game where every piece was in place, every card marked, and any attempt to subvert the rules cost more than anyone could afford. "So, is this it?" he asked, his voice hoarse and bitter. "Either I become part of the machine, or I disappear?" Blackthorne smiled slightly. "Ah, Daniel, we are all part of the machine. The only difference is knowing it." Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, her hands shaking. You've destroyed our lives. You've ripped away pieces of our history, as if we were nothing more than a figure in a contract." Her voice cracked, filled with anger and pain and helplessness. Blackthorne didn't even look at her directly. "My dear, we didn't create this world. We just keep it going. And sometimes that requires sacrifice." Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He gripped the gun, took a deep breath, and in a moment of absolute silence, the line between justice and survival simply collapsed. His finger loosened. He let go of the pistol. It clattered to the floor with a final, dry thud. "What if I told you I don't want to be a part of this anymore? Not your game, not your charade," he said, staring at Blackthorne as if trying to pierce the emptiness in his eyes. Blackthorne took 2 steps forward, bent down, picked up the gun and smiled. "Oh, Daniel, you never had that choice. The only choice is how you're going to forget." The next few hours were lost in a haze of despair and veiled agreements. Daniel, Eleanor, and their father were taken to one of the headquarters of Blackthorne Lenteters in the city center. There, faced with contracts, veiled threats, and empty promises, Daniel understood exactly what was happening. Everything would be erased. The evidence, the records, the witnesses, the entire life of that investigation. It would be erased as if it had never existed, and, in exchange, they would live. On one condition: never again, ever, open their mouths about what they knew. At the end of that day, Eleanor held Daniel's hand as they watched from the sidewalk as the black Bentley disappeared into the distance, taking with it the ghosts that could never be buried. She looked into his eyes, her lips trembling. And now, what are we? Daniel lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and replied in the bitterest voice she had ever heard. Now, we are just scars. And scars, you can't erase them. You just learn to live with them. The wind blew, bringing the smell of the city, of sea air, of wet concrete, of broken promises. And in that moment, Daniel realized that the greatest mystery was how certain things could continue to exist, even after everything had been absolutely destroyed. If you like this story, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate notifications so you don't miss future content. See you later.